Just to recognize one more person, last is a colleague of mine from George Mason University School of Public Policy, Andy Brown, sitting there, very sadly recently. Thank you for coming. Our next speaker is Dr. Richard Williams, and just to give you a summary of his accomplishment, he is a surgeon by training, was deployed during the First Gulf War in Middle East. He was raised actually in Middle East, and was commander of a hospital. He's a pilot. I think he has over 3,500 hours flying, instrument flying, and he's a senior federal administration agency, Federal Aviation Administration Agency examiner. Just for a story with the famous Italian 1700s, 18th century father of occupational health center about the health of the mariners. He recognized that sailors had to fly. He said that ministering for chronic diseases among the explorers at sea or the sailors is not going to end up well. And it remains the same for spaceflight. One has to protect people for not getting sick. But that's an element, and that's one of the most difficult tasks that a physician sitting on Earth has to face when somebody is in space, to develop standards and make sure that people stay healthy, fly healthy, and return healthy without disease. So Dr. Williams is going to acquaint us about the policy and not the politics, because the medicine doesn't take very well politics, but the policies and the standards of how medicine is practiced, given that there is a growing interest among what the federal government does, both in safety and health, for its programs, its estimate, and what is being announced by the Congress, and that's what the qualifications are for the commercial flyers and space tourists. So, without any further ado, Dr. Williams, who published a lot and has won several faculty appointments, please go ahead.
Thanks, Arnold. I'll reiterate what was said by the other speakers. It's a privilege to be here to talk to you today. You know, concerning your question, sir, about the tangible and intangible benefits of the space station, I reflect on that quite often, being intimately involved in the human spaceflight. And when you ask that question, I kind of moved your head a little bit. I don't know if this is sound too far-fetched, especially in front of the NASA chief scientist here. But I think I would agree with Stephen Hawking that really nothing less than the survival of the species is at stake with what we're doing here. And we just, I mean, the immense complexity of the robotic missions that Dr. Bellotti described are made immeasurably more complex when you take a human and put him in the middle of all that hardware. The human is invariably the most vulnerable system within the spacecraft system. And the human will drive anything from spacecraft design to mission architecture more than any other feature of any mission involving the humans that are part of. And we just don't know yet what space really does to humans. We must know, because we have to learn to survive in space. Now, the far-fetched part comes in that I don't know whether the imperative to leave the planet is measured in geologic time, or whether it's a little more immediate based on the asteroid impact and threat or whatever. But I think at the end of the day, we can all agree that the threat is very real and that this is an extremely important endeavor. So the space station is our venue for understanding what happens to people in space. And I think we made some recent discoveries and revelations just by observing what normally happens to humans in space that I think will dramatically make that point in just a few minutes. I want to take you sort of through a talk that will hopefully personalize space medicine a bit for you. We'll emphasize a series of risks and we'll emphasize some technologies, but I want to say right up front that my focus is the practice of medicine. I'm a practitioner still of medicine. And I started, like Arnold said, I started off being a surgeon the first 15 to 17 years of my career, as an operating surgeon. And I got to tell you, the complexity of the physician-patient relationship as a surgeon doesn't compare to the complexity of doctor-patient relationship in aerospace medicine, and that reaches its pinnacle in space medicine. When I sat across from a patient who had colon cancer, the respective roles of me as the surgeon and the patient as the patient were very clear. We all had the same role. There's no question in my mind I was going to operate that patient, I was going to take care of the colon cancer, and we're all going to hope for the best. It is a bit ironic that in the case of space medicine, where we're practicing on arguably the most thoroughly medically screened and maybe healthiest population of people in the world, the relationship is incredibly more personal, incredibly more complex, and you must not, as so often happens in modern medicine, become a technician, okay? You must remain a physician. So I want to communicate that to you as well as some of the other technical things that we get into here. One has been said about the space environment this morning, and I'll just reiterate. It is the most dangerous environment that machines or humans have ever ventured into. In addition to vacuum temperature extremes and so on and so forth, you can boil the significant exposure factors to humans from the environment itself down to three major exposure factors. One is microgravity, which Mark talked about at length, and the same genetic upregulation and downregulation that happens to virulent microorganisms also happens in the macroorganism of the human. Everything that happens in us is an expression of genetics, one way or another. So the loss of bone in microgravity is a genetically mediated process at the end of the day. So those things, that principle holds from the microorganism to the full macroorganism like humans. The other big physical factor that affects humans adversely is radiation. We'll get into that a little more. And then the last, maybe the most significant thing today is isolation and confinement. And in addition to that, as you move out of lower orbit into exploration class missions, there's distance from the planet, which exacerbates not only communication delays, but certainly isolation and confinement and behavioral health sorts of implications attached to that. Physiology is profoundly affected in microgravity, as well as potential for behavioral health sorts of changes. That's just sort of a little potpourri of physiology liability areas. We're going to talk about a few of those today in a little bit more detail, especially the one at the upper right, which is the visual impairment and elevated cranial pressure phenomenon that we've recently seen in a number of crewmen that have returned from long-duration space flight on the International Space Station. Of course, the shorter duration of exposure in the space environment, the less these things express themselves, but they're all there. In addition to the inherent exposure factors of microgravity and the foibles and liabilities of living in a complex machine, okay? And by that I mean you have to have the breathable air mixture just right. If the carbon dioxide goes a little higher than it should, that causes symptoms. If you have escape of volatile organics that are necessary components of parts of the spacecraft, and that can cause exposures that can end up in cancer and neurologic damage in the short term. I mean, there's a lot of different. The International Space Station or any spacecraft is an industrial setting, and the whole spectrum of industrial accidents that can happen can certainly happen there. So Hence, as a matter of policy, we approach astronaut health and space medicine practice as sort of a subset or an application of occupational medicine. Well, in addition to all that, there's the possibility of disease arising in our patient population while they're in the extreme environment of space. And again, the longer period of time people stay in space, the more likely one of these things is to happen. These are all conditions, and this is not exhaustive. This is an example from the year 2000 of things that have happened in the population of active flight assignable astronauts. Okay? And a lot of these things are very, very serious, and they could be lethal in a space environment where circulating blood volume is low and resistance to the immune system is compromised, and so on and so forth. But each one of these problems has happened not once, but some of them multiple times. We've been very lucky in that none of these particular things have happened during a period of time when we've had crew in space. We on the U.S. side have never had to abandon a mission, foreshorten a mission, or evacuate a crew based on a medical reason, which I think is remarkable. It's a testimony to two things. Number one, I suppose, good fortune. Number two, our exhaustive medical screening and preventive health measures. But that has to be augmented by a lot of luck, not to have had a bad event up to now. And every day of my life, I'm aware that we're kind of a heartbeat away from having a spectacular event on station that would captivate the national and international news in a way that tourism is doing. So we have to be aware of these things, and we have to develop, to the best of our ability, ways to mitigate these sorts of risks in space as well. Through the years, we've recognized the benefit of analog environments and tried to exploit them as much as possible. From physiologic monitoring of teams that have ascended and summited Mount Everest with NASA principal investigator involvement, to aquatic and environments. That's a picture of the Aquarius facility and a bunch of NASA folks, astronauts, and divers that have launched a series of missions in the Aquarius underwater habitat. It's 60-foot sea level on the seabed off Key Largo. And submarines also a pretty good analog for space stations and spacecraft. People living in a complex machine. Dr. Abelati might recognize that South Pole station on the upper right, and Mawson's Hut just below that in the Australian Antarctic expeditions from the early part of the 20th century. Antarctica may be, from a terrestrial perspective, maybe the environment, the extreme environment that carries the most fidelity for our space medicine exposures and practice. We can actually evacuate people from the space station with more urgently and more reliably than you can evacuate somebody from Antarctica in the dead of winter. That's our current venue of practice, the International Space Station. Front orbiting at a height of about 233 statute miles. Our medical care capability of the ISS is it's always limited in spaceflight by up mass and limitations and power limitations, storage limitations. It's not as robust as we'd like to see it by any stretch of the imagination, but there are key elements of the system that we're quite keen on. Our ultrasound capability, for instance, that is our imaging modality of choice for space flight at the moment, and probably will remain so for the indefinite future. And I think, as well, we showed earlier, some of our work in ultrasonography in this extreme environment is translating and augmenting the application of ultrasonography for bedside diagnosis and in extreme environments where resources are scarce on Earth. This is the policy intersection between human spaceflight and the practice of space medicine and the mission itself. we approach all these plethora of risks that we've identified this morning, first by, like I said, with an occupational health approach. And that implies that we publish standards that are designed to be adhered to, for the most part, and designed to be protective of the health of the crew before, during, and even after the mission. And we have several sets of these things. And by the way, I didn't mention, Mark talked about the international cooperation necessary with the International Space Station. We have developed an integrated medical care system between the Russian system, the Japanese system, the European system, the Canadian system, and us, with wide variations in culture and expectations and nature of doctor-patient relationship. We've created an integrated system that's working quite well in the last decade, of which we're all very proud. It's pretty seamless, and it's all mediated by the end result, which we all share, the end goal, which we all share, which is a healthy patient. Which you've got common ground as an end goal, it's not so hard to be on common ground and make that happen, even if practice isn't different. So we've got these standards for medical selection and qualification, for selection to the astronaut corps, to qualify for training in neutral buoyancy facilities and T-38s, complex high-performance aircraft, for short-duration space flight. Not so much applicable in the post-shuttle era for us. It certainly will be for the commercial space industry. And by the way, the FAA has established a Center of Excellence for commercial space flight. And they've got some very eminent authorities in aerospace medicine working on FAA crew selection and medical qualification standards for commercial space flight. They don't exist right now, only for atmospheric flight. So that's going to be a complex exercise in FAA. We'll help them with that. For long duration flight, and then we will have to ultimately strap on and create health standards for exploration class missions beyond where mission duration is not measured in the 6-month increment we do now, but in year to beyond year time frame. We have environmental health standards. I mentioned potential exposure to toxicants and physical forces like sound and noise that can injure you. We've got all of those. We have spaceflight-specific exposure standards with regard to things like radiation and bone loss and so on and so forth. Those specific exposure factors in spaceflight that can harm people just by the radiation, isolation, confinement, and microgravity. We're developing space medicine standards of practice, clinical practice guidelines, outcome expectations. And you can't really expect the same outcome for somebody who develops appendicitis on the International Space Station as opposed to somebody who develops appendicitis on Elm Street, Maintown, USA. So we're struggling with how to adjust, how to establish standards of practice and expectation and outcome expectations for clinical exercises in space, and that's all under development. We wouldn't be doing that, by the way, without the International Space Station, which at the end of the day is an analog, if you will, for long duration space flight and exploration class space flight. All of those standards which guide selection and qualification for crew ultimately drive requirements that are applied to human spaceflight programs and human spaceflight design. And those requirements, since the human is the most vulnerable, those standards and requirements end up, in my opinion, the major limiting factors, or certainly among the major limiting factors applicable to the human spaceflight program. So that's sort of an end-to-end policy continuum and how that happens. Now, just to give you, again, a little bit more information about some of the nuances and things that we struggle with. Everything is a little bit different in my regard, even down to the simple things that appear simple anyway. Basic life support, the CPR on the ground is very easy. The person's usually on the floor, you kneel beside them, and you go ahead and achieve chest compressions. This is Carl Waltz, who did a little experiment a little bit with measuring the efficacy of force applied during simulated CPR to the sensor pack. And he ultimately found that the best way to do it was to stretch himself across the module, plant his feet on a likely surface on the opposite wall, and use his leg muscles to achieve compression. That was the most, it's just a simple example of how everything changes in the microgravity environment in space. It has to be just a few specifics about the risks. I think everybody who's contributing taxpayer dollars to the International Space Stations and human spaceflight programs should know this. Astronauts lose bone in space. This turns out to be a pretty good high fidelity analog for what happens in aging as well. Generally speaking, about 1% of, oh good, does that mean we can go ahead and anyway, generally speaking, you lose about 1% of bone per month in weight bearing areas. And of course that has implications, potentially. The longer you're in space, at the moment it seems like the more bone you lose. Again, through the International Space Stations, we stretch the interval of habitation out. We'll find out what happens. Does this bone loss level off at a certain level, or does it continue linearly? We don't know. Hopefully we'll find out. But it has mission impact with regard to musculoskeletal injuries. If you're going to Mars and you suffer a musculoskeletal injury, well, that can have some very profound impact to you once you're on the planetary surface. Not to mention that, but liberation of bone from into the bloodstream can also result in deposition of calcium elsewhere, like in the form of kidney stones. And interestingly, most of you, I think, have probably heard of urine processor assembly that actually takes urine and processes it to drinking water. Well, the original design of that used as terrestrially acquired urine as the test medium. And it turns out when you get in space, the calcium load is much higher. So right off the bat, the urine processor assembly several years ago, when it was first deployed, developed kidney stones. Okay? So anyway, obviously, just an interesting anecdote. So there's a whole spectrum of things that can happen if we don't control and mitigate that particular bone loss. Not only for the mission itself, but also for the astronauts like that mission. Our current kind of measures, I'll say right up front right now, we have exercise devices, treadmill, cyclometer, and a fairly good resistive exercise device. And that helps some, but it doesn't mitigate the bone loss. Bone mineral content does over time, in most astronauts, return to a baseline of approaching normal after the mission. But what we worry about is with quantitative CT scans, it's beginning to look like the alveolar bone. Bone consists of an outer dense layer and an innermost porous layer. And the porous layer contributes substantially to the strength of the bone. That's what's attacked in osteoporosis. On the upper right, you see an electron micrograph of normal bone. And below that is osteoporotic bone, because you see some of the bridges are broken and the structure is a great deal thin. It looks like that doesn't protect based on quantitative CT scans. So in the process of studying that, we're learning about it. And again, we wouldn't be able to do that without the International Space Station. Moving on to space radiation. Galactic cosmic rays, which are the nuclei or every atom periodic table, the heavy ones are flowing through the space all the time. Protons, electrons from solar particle radiation, and then the Saturnitic anomaly, which is pictured there on the lower right side, is an area of trapped radiation where the Van Allen belts approach closest to the Earth's surface. Again, if there were one exposure factor that limited long duration exploration past mission at this point, I'd have to say most demonstrably would be radiation. On the left, you see cellular damage from gamma radiation. We've got a water large population of people who have been extensively exposed to gamma radiation. That's the Hiroshima and Nagasaki survivor group. They've got many years of observation. We pretty much know what gamma radiation does to people. On the right are the little pinpricks of light. On the left are punctate damage points from gamma radiation. These cosmic rays blast out straight through the cells, and they cause large tracts of linear disruption, and that breaks up the event and can kill cells. It can do everything from cause immediate, with too much exposure, immediate harm, like just sensitive tissues like the brain and central nervous system. Could conceivably degrade your cognitive ability for a long period of time, and certainly probably increases your chance for malignancy later on in life. So, our dosage limitations for career are based on the likelihood of radiation causing cancer. But we don't know, unlike the gamma radiation, we don't have a large database about what gamma radiation does. And as Dr. Abdullah said earlier, we're doing a lot of investment in reproducing gamma rays terrestrially, gamma ray facsimiles anyway, and figuring out exactly what the biological effect of these radiation is, and living in advanced shield. Again, we need to understand the biology, we need countermeasures and shielding. I'll say that all of these risks are mitigated if we can somehow figure out with the engineer's help how to get from point A to point B faster. Okay. Limit the exposure time, you limit the exposure. So that probably is the ultimate key, is figuring out how to get from here to there where we're going in quick time. The third exposure factor, the third area of liability has to do with behavioral health. If you put any group of people in a closed environment for any amount of time, there are myriad of problems. I'll be very interested to see what publications come out of the Russian Mars 500 experiment. I was there in Moscow a month ago or so, about 3 days before that group of folks exited their 500-day experiment. We're very interested to see what happened there. But when you talk about, that's in Moscow. It's in the Institute of Biomedical Problems. If something really bad happened, you open the door. Okay. We really have no clue. In Antarctica, you can see some really bizarre behaviors. Okay, and interpersonal problems with people wintering over. It's real. I saw that when I took 400 people to war in Southwest Asia. Okay, some behaviors that I couldn't believe, that I know I wouldn't see back in the United States. I saw plenty of. But we have really no clue when you start talking about these distances away from home. Really, we're in the unknown territory. So this picture on the left is from the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, I think, which was able to image with magnification the Earth-Moon system. On the right is what you're going to see if you're standing on the Martian surface, with that little dot at the bottom being Jupiter. That little bitty faint blue dot up there on the top of the screen being Earth. So what kind of profound effect does that have psychologically? We just don't know. And they probably won't until we actually do it. That's why I say this might be the biggest area of liability, and we just won't know. I mentioned a new, it's really not new, but it's recently recognized clinical problem a little bit earlier. And I think, by the way, that this is probably not the last one of these we'll see. As people extend their stay on the International Space Station, we may get other surprises. But astronauts for years have talked about changes in visual acuity. Well, it turns out that when people stay in space, a subset of folks, for a long period of time, there are some fairly profound physiological changes that happen, both to the eyeball and the optic nerve, and to the cerebrospinal fluid circulation, to cause a constellation of findings, the end result of which is degraded visual acuity. But again, people with this particular adaptation to space stay longer in space. We don't really know what the endpoint of this is. I mean, worst case scenario with you see edema or swelling of the optic nerve. If that continues, the optic nerve can become compromised to the point where you lose portions of your vision or maybe all of your vision. The eyeball is flattened from half to full, which changes the focal length of the lens. The retina of the eye becomes folded probably because of the derangement in physical shape of the eyeball, but maybe also by congestion of veins that normally drain the eye. This is all probably related to the redistribution of fluid that occurs in microgravity. We carry a lot of fluid in our lower extremities. You can't really see it, except in somebody with pathology like congestive heart failure. But in our buttocks and our pelvis and our legs and our feet, there's a lot of fluid. In microgravity, it all redistributes. So your face gets puffy. You feel like you've got a bad cold, or you've got allergies, and so on and so forth. And this happens. So we're at the leading edge of this. And we're kind of using this in the agency as a sort of a test case for refocusing practice and integrating medical practice and research efforts. We're basically aiming every technique we can think of when we look at this particular problem. From expert consultation from individual cases, we're rolling out experts in benign intracranial hypertension. We'd like to mention in these folks, cerebrospinal fluid pressure goes up. And this bears some resemblance to that particular terrestrial disorder. To traditional peer-reviewed research solicitations, to sort of fast-track, quickly reviewed research protocols to try to figure out if one methodology or another is effective in dealing with this beyond a single patient, to solicited open innovation techniques. So we've got an integrated project going at the Johnson Space Center that's trying to leverage all of those sorts of methodologies to try to understand this and figure out a solution to it. And finally, just a quick example of transfer or augmentation of practice on Earth that comes directly from space medicine. I mentioned that ultrasound is really the only modality that we can use reliably in space to image pathology. So in the center is a screenshot of a training program where ultrasonographers on the ground train naive non-medical individuals like astronauts to perform ultrasound in space. Those folks go and they do ultrasound in space on each other, and the images get beamed back to the planet for analysis. And the principal investigator for that particular exercise is the guy on the far right in the lower screenshot there. It's Scott Dupont. And he's there doing the same thing with one of the trainers from the Detroit Red Wings. And this is evolving into, or has evolved into, an augmented use of ultrasound in many venues of practice, including the emergency room, the focus assisted assessment of surgical trauma, focus assessment by sonography for trauma program that's employed widely in emergency rooms. I think that's about all I have. Any questions?
Yeah, I'm a nurse and throat surgeon, and talking about CSF and packing visual and certainly the balance system. I think that hearing loss is so much concern. Obviously, as people age, we see that with their balance function decreasing, they become very reliant upon their visual systems. The lights go out and an elderly person falls to the floor. We're in a space where you don't have the ability to use position sense, or you can feel, but you don't have position sense, and you don't have gravity. I would see that loss of vision would be the final death that would be functionless.
Yeah, you kind of adapt your proprioceptive ability, you really don't lose that. And you adapt, there's a great deal of plasticity, I suppose, in the ability to adapt from a CNS perspective to space. But you're right, you're absolutely right. Vision predominates in any aerospace environment. That's one of the first principles you learn in aerospace medicine. And it would not only have critical mission impact, but would also be a profound disability to have. It would be a mess. So,
Yes, on the communication leg between here and Mars or any other place in the solar system, you should be able to build an artificial intelligence system that the two people try to communicate, talk with, and it does communication that tries to absorb some of those legs using what it knows about your responses to respond with the other person. It should be a very interesting system to build.
absolutely. And there's a lot of, we've envisioned just that with regard to the story forward, ability and virtual consultation ability for immediate help. Sort of like the Star Trek hologram, doctor up here, not quite that elegant at this point in time, but there certainly exists the ability at this point to provide a lot of consultative expertise and sort of forward. And who knows, maybe by the time we actually do go on these exploration class missions, that can be a feature of autonomous nuclear system. I'm sorry, sir.
On an average space station crew, unless one of the crew persons were a medical doctor, do they all have the same kind of basic, like Boy Scout manual, how to set up phone and how to handle shot, or is somebody designated that gets a little bit extra for those, for at least current missions?
It is, as you say, everybody gets a baseline first aid and sort of EMT-like training. But for each mission, there's designated a crew medical officer who spends time in emergency rooms and has enhanced skills to be able to start intravenous lines and those sorts of things. And that he acts as surrogate on-site flight surgeon guided by whoever's on the ground. Fascinating relationships because the astronaut at the same time is a surrogate scientist, executing science programs, a research subject, and the surrogate physician and medical monitor. So it's extremely complex and interesting.
One more question. Yes.
Do you have a plan to use genetic enhancement technology for next generation astronauts?
Wow. No. Currently, there's I think a still standing executive order that really limits our ability even to use any sort of genetic information, even family history for job selection. I mean, that applies across the boards for anybody hiring anybody. And it also could impact our selection process. I think that ultimately we will evolve as a society where those sorts of things are necessary and ethical and everything else, but not enhanced genetics, but the ability to select using genetic information is far more specific than we have now. That will evolve to that, and probably will need to use it for these long duration, non-recorded missions.
So directed surgery for eyesight would be out?
Preserved. That's absolutely in. We prefer the laser procedure, but that's not disqualified.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for seeing. I would like also to recognize why usually when I'm sharing, I said that's the last one. No, that's not the last one. I would like to recognize a very important person in the amount of audience. No, all of you are important. It's Admiral Conrad Mottenbacher. Welcome. Thank you for coming. The former law administrator and I don't know if Mr. Barnes left, no, he's building. I want to say give us any comments at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Our next speaker is Franceska Schroeder, and she's a lawyer, a friend of mine. She's a lawyer, and she is involved in a private, she's involved in a private law firm called Richardson, and where she deals with white-collar crime, commercial space, and other activities. But she has been advisor to the American, legal advisor to the American Astronomical Society. She has been she is also a private sector advisor to the UN Committee on Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, right? That's what it is. And she has been testifying and speaking extensively on the issue of commercialization. And as you know, commercialization is more than just flying people in space. And now she has got added opportunity to deal with space tourism. Right? So without any further ado, Franceska, it's in your hands and guide us through the intricacies of the law.
Good morning, everyone. I don't have any pictures in my presentation, so I'm a little worried about that. But I promise to make it as interesting as I can and to take all of your questions. I just have to say the best thing that happened this morning was I got jewelry the moment I walked in. I knew it was going to be a great day when that happened. So Arnold very kindly mentioned that I'm his friend, true, a lawyer, true, and I do white-collar criminal defense, that's also true, but let me explain the context of that. Most of my practice involves the aerospace and defense industries, particularly space. That's the overwhelming majority of my work. And I represent private companies that interact with NASA to a great extent, with the Air Force, but also with each other. One commercial space company wanting to do a transaction or buy a product like a satellite or launch service from another private company. And there are myriad legal issues that arise in connection with that relationship. And the best example of, and the most recent example of something that was in the news that I worked on was the Mars Science Lab, because there are tremendous legal issues involved in getting that wonderful rover from the Earth to Mars without breaking any laws. And ensuring that the risk management program affiliated with that high-risk activity is covered, meaning the insurance is in place, the indemnification provisions, if any, and there were two, in fact, that are available from the U.S. government that make sure that those are in place before anything goes wrong. So when you see these brilliant and inspiring scientific marvels, believe it or not, there's a lawyer involved in there somewhere too. I'm very lucky to work with some brilliant lawyers at NASA. Very, very lucky to do that. And also with the State Department through the work that I do with the UN. So what I want to do today is go through what is going to look like a relatively dense presentation. It's mainly dense because I wanted to get you the information that I thought you would find useful and just try to brief the slides as efficiently as I can. And then, like I said, take the questions. So with that, I'll begin. And how do those slides get advanced? Just here, okay.
Just press the arrows.
I got it, I figured it out.
If it has.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so very briefly, the three big topics we're going to cover today is an overview of the laws and regulations that I said stand behind all of these inspiring missions. The international treaties that address space activities, because it's not just U.S. law that we have to worry about. Believe it or not, it was international law that was set in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and ever evolving that resulted in the promulgation of domestic laws so that the U.S. could fulfill its international obligations. And then talk about something that came up in a conversation earlier today, and that is export controls and how do you manage the very strict prohibitions on certain exchanges and still do robust and effective international cooperation. All right, so there are a set of laws that apply to both governmental and non-governmental missions. As I said before, my work, a perfect example of that. Often I'm interacting on behalf of my clients with the federal government. Other times I'm helping my client, a private sector company, engage with another private sector company. U.S. laws cover all of those relationships. And the four principal legal regimes or statutes that cover these activities are those listed here. The Commercial Space Launch Act, which is which exists to license and regulate commercial expendable launch vehicle operations as well as re-entry launch vehicle operations. Land Remote Sensing Policy Act, which covers commercial remote sensing satellite systems. Communications Act of 1934, which covers the frequencies that are beamed up and beamed down from commercial satellites. And the Space Act, which also was discussed earlier today, the act that gives NASA life and tells NASA what to do, so to speak. All right, the first one that I address is the CSLA, the Commercial Space Launch Act. From a commercial perspective, this is the most important law because without it, there would be no commercial launch industry. This statute, I'll go through the points here. It opens access to space and encourages private sector development. It simplifies and expedites the issuance and transfer of launch and re-entry licenses, promotes safety because the FAA has multiple responsibilities, one of which is to ensure that the public is safe when rockets are being launched, and to strengthen and expand the space transportation infrastructure. Well, how are all of these things done? Other than simply to say it's done by the FAA. Well, it's done by the FAA issuing a launch license. That means that the FAA has to review your plans to launch a rocket from the U.S., or if you're a U.S. person wanting to launch a rocket from someplace outside of the U.S. The CSLA gives the FAA the authority to license and regulate that launch activity. And the license is required for a launch and re-entry, as I said, either by a U.S. citizen, whether in the U.S. or outside of the U.S. And for a launch and re-entry of a U.S. citizen, excuse me, in a foreign country, excuse me, if the U.S. has jurisdiction by agreement with the government of a foreign country. So an interesting example there is, I don't know if you must be familiar with the Sea Launch Venture, which is the commercial launch platform that is sailed to a point near the equator in the Pacific. That's not U.S. territory, but the principal integrator of that project originally was Boeing. So the companies that were involved in sea launch at the beginning, which included Russian, Ukrainian, Norwegian, and American companies, went to the FAA and sought licensing jurisdiction by the FAA because there are significant benefits to being licensed and regulated by the United States government. Believe it or not, we sometimes get jaded being inside the beltway of, I would say, the Republic is safe despite the fact that Congress is in session. But other people view it as the good housekeeping seal of approval, that the government, U.S. government says it's okay, somebody smart must have looked at it and said it was okay. So there is actually a marketing benefit to being able to say that you are licensed and regulated by a U.S. federal agency. Okay, so the other CSLA requirements, which are very important both to protecting the space environment, protecting the earth environment, protecting people, aircraft and flight, all of those things happen because of these other requirements. The license is subject to policy, safety, and environmental impact reviews. The launch provider, the licensee, if you will, must provide information to the FAA for compliance with an international treaty called the Registration Convention, which we'll discuss later. Orbital debris mitigation. We all know what an incredible problem orbital debris is, what a difficult challenge that is to address. So one thing the U.S. government is doing, not only at the FAA, but you see in a couple slides, also the FCC and NOAA, if you want to engage in space activity, you have to present a debris mitigation program so that at least we're not making an already challenging problem worse. And then with respect to the advent of commercial personal spaceflight, where you're getting space tourists, the FAA is working on qualifications, training, safety, and waivers of claims issues against the U.S. So if you choose to be a spaceflight participant, say on a suborbital vehicle, like, for example, Virgin Galactic, which is going to take people on suborbital flights leaving New Mexico at some impressive pace at some point. If the FAA licenses that system, which it will, because it's flying out of New Mexico, needless to say, the U.S. government doesn't want all of these citizen astronaut suing them if something goes wrong. So there are going to be safety requirements that have to be acknowledged, of course. The citizen astronauts will have to undergo certain training, and then there will have to be a waiver and release of claims to some extent. All of this is evolving, of course, at the last part. Okay, now, at the beginning of my CSLA discussion, I said that this was probably the most important statute from a commercial space perspective because it allows commercial operators to conduct commercial launch services without vetting the company every time. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if a private company like Boeing or Lockheed Martin or Orbital wants to fly one of their vehicles, they don't have to worry about that vehicle going out of control. Well, they do have to worry about that, but for other reasons. They don't have to worry about the vehicle behaving in a bad way that results in significant property damage and loss of life. Because there is a requirement that, of course, it be baseline safe. I mean, that is a given. So I'm talking about, anomalies that are rare but still need to be addressed. The FAA license application process requires that the launch operator purchase insurance in an amount that reflects the maximum probable loss. And the statutory limit of that is $500 million. Because that is the amount of money that the U.S. government thinks is affordable and available in the private sector insurance market to cover these kinds of claims. But in a horrific and highly unlikely event, the claims might in fact exceed $500 million. And a company that engages in this activity might not be able to afford that kind of a loss. That's what I mean by paying a company every time you fly. So if it turns out in a horrific circumstance, and I should say not only a rare circumstance, but one that's, thank goodness, never ever occurred, but if the claims exceed the amount of insurance, then the U.S. government will step in and pay those claims in excess of the insurance, up to $1.5 billion, which actually is adjusted for inflation, so now the amount is really closer to $2.2 billion. So there is a significant risk management regime that is in place here to protect the private sector participants from financial ruin if the absolute worst case scenario comes to fruition. And like I said, thank goodness, in all the years that we've been flying commercially, and this statute was originally passed in 1984 and then significantly amended in 88, there have been other amendments since then. So since that time, there has never been a claim, thank goodness. But just in case, this protection is in place. And then the U.S. government, or I should say Congress and the administration, when they wrote this statute back in the 80s, they decided that it would be a good idea if all of these, these sophisticated adults who are involved in this high-risk activity called space activities, launch activities, that they should recognize that everybody's role in this is high risk. So they should waive claims against each other. If something goes wrong, you can't sue me and I can't sue you. If you suffer property loss, you should have procured insurance to cover that loss, and you should look to that insurance to cover that loss. You shouldn't sue me. I tried my best to do a great job launching your satellite, and you tried your best to ensure that your satellite wouldn't do anything to misbehave and hurt my launch vehicle. But if that happens, we're all adults, we all know how high risk this is, we have agreed contractually to waive claims against each other. And that is a requirement that these parties enter into these class waivers. It's a requirement of the CSLA. So without this highly sophisticated and obviously somewhat complex risk management regime, perhaps commercial companies would not have felt comfortable about getting into this business. Perhaps their shareholders wouldn't have liked it if they had gone into this high-risk activity without this very comprehensive risk management regime in place. Okay, so another very important statute is the Land Remote Sensing Policy Act of 1992. And this statute was enacted to promote and support the commercial remote sensing industry. And there are, over the course of the many years that this statute has been in place, Many entities have been licensed. Unfortunately, not many entities have succeeded, but the two that are most well-known are Digital Globe and GOI. They were licensed by NOAA and are up and running and taking great pictures, and the U.S. government is a customer and private sector entities are customers. And without this statute, there would have been no legal framework for supporting that industry, for supporting the commercial remote sensing industry. So just to highlight these, some of these bullets here, the purpose of the statute was to stimulate commercial marketing for unenhanced remotely sensed data and to further the long-term role of commercialization of remote sensing and to promote international trade and access to unenhanced data on a non-discriminatory basis. So the way those purposes are achieved, just like in the FAA CSLA context, is through licensing. It's through the application process and the exchange between the commercial operator and the regulator, in this case NOAA, to talk about what it is that you want to do with your remote sensing platform, and let's talk about whether you're going to do it in a manner that's going to be consistent with U.S. law and policy. So as part of that license application process, you have to provide NOAA with orbit and data collection characteristics and any deviation, proper post-mission disposal. Again, it's that effort to minimize debris that we discussed before. And then interestingly, the U.S. government requires its prior approval for any significant or substantial agreement with a foreign entity. So the purpose of that is really one that is foreign policy and national security based. And that says that you, commercial operator, can operate your remote sensing platform and sell the data. The data itself, by the way, is not controlled for export. And we want you to have a robust business, but we don't want you to engage in an agreement with a foreign entity that will require you to do things to provide data, to sense certain areas that you should, that for whatever reason you shouldn't be sensed, and you know that it shouldn't be sensed. We don't want you to engage in any of those agreements in a manner that's inconsistent with U.S. law, because that would be a violation of your license. So you can engage in these foreign agreements or agreements with foreign entities, but you have to get our approval first. We want to make sure that what you're saying in that agreement is consistent with U.S. law and policy. Okay, and then again, keeping in line with this foreign policy and national security analysis, you, the commercial operator, can do these things provided they're consistent with U.S. goals. So you can make available to the government of any country unenhanced data related to territory under the jurisdiction of that government. You can make unenhanced data designated by Secretary of Commerce available to all users without preference or special arrangement regarding delivery, pricing, or technical considerations. And you may make data available at reduced prices for non-commercial purposes such as education or research. And in fact, since many of these systems have been operating, well, the two main systems have been operating for so long, there's quite a remarkable database of remotely sensed data that is available, I believe, at no cost. That's not the real-time data that you have to pay for, but. Okay. So the next one is the Communications Act of 1934, and this is the statute that the Federal Communications Commission is responsible for administering. And it sets forth the licensing and operating requirements for satellites and ground stations. And for those of you who maybe are lawyers in the audience, the section of the regulations, the Code of Federal Regulations that applies here is Part 25. So you might hear somebody, in shorthand say, I'm operating a Part 25 licensed system. That means you're operating a commercial communications system that has been licensed by the FCC under Part 25 of its rules. So what are the purposes of this statute? It's to ensure that the licensed operator, the satellite operator, will not cause radio frequency interference, that the activity of operating the spacecraft will be coordinated, not only domestically but also internationally. And the reason it has to be coordinated both domestically and internationally, because as everybody in this room I'm sure knows, the radio frequency spectrum is quite a precious resource, and it needs to be used as efficiently as possible because a lot of people want to communicate a lot of stuff. And And if you're communicating over each other and crossing signals and causing harmful interference, then not only will the spectrum not be used efficiently, but you'll be wasting that which can be used efficiently. So there's a very actually elaborate coordination process that's undertaken by every communications operator that wants to operate a new system. They have to go through a process through the International Telecommunication Union in Geneva to ensure that its system is not going to interfere with any other system that either already is operating or is already planned to be operating. And again, another benefit for being a U.S. citizen who wants to do this, the FCC acts as your representative to the ITU for this coordination process. So whenever a client comes to me and says, oh my goodness, you have so many rules in the U.S., I have to follow all these rules, I'm like, yes, but look at the benefits of following those rules. And then they're not so interested in going offshore anymore. Okay. Again, so now we're seeing, a third example. We're talking about the third statute on the list, and the third example of how debris mitigation is a very important issue. Also in these FCC rules, you have to make sure that the system that you're seeking to get licensed complies with orbital debris mitigation requirements. And the purposes, of course, are obvious to everyone known here. You have to submit your mitigation plan with the license application, because failure to achieve the requirements for debris mitigation is a basis upon which to reject your application. So the FCC takes debris mitigation very seriously. And then end of life, of course, that's another element that's taken very seriously, also from a debris mitigation perspective, but also from a frequency coordination perspective. So you have to comply with ITU requirements, and when you comply with those ITU requirements, by extension, you're complying with the U.S. legal requirements for end-of-life operation. Okay, now I feel very silly talking about the Space Act in this room with so many people from NASA here, but the statute was the enabling legislation for NASA, and it has myriad objectives and has been a great source of guidance for commercial space. In fact, the risk management regime that I described under the Commercial Space Launch Act, that originated under a plan that was designed for space operations between NASA and its commercial contractors. Now, those were the four principal statutes that I wanted to highlight today, but there are other laws that are relevant to the commercial use of space, and a certain section of Title 15 of the U.S. Code this helps to facilitate access to U.S. government facilities that will support commercial space activities. Title 35 of the U.S. Code, which features the U.S. patent laws. U.S. patent laws apply to inventions made in space on a space object under U.S. jurisdiction or control. And then Title 42 contains a section that provides for the acquisition of space science data from commercial providers. So all of this, as I said before, all of this domestic law exists not only because we are a nation of laws, obviously, we take rule of law enormously seriously, but also because we have international obligations that have to be flowed down to private citizens. And the way that's done is through the promulgation of U.S. domestic law. Well, there are actually 5 main treaties, international space treaties. The one that's missing from this list is the Moon Treaty, and I didn't include it because the United States is not a signatory. Very few countries, I believe only 7 countries are signatories. And there are efforts to have the Moon Treaty perhaps not exist anymore. So I wanted to spend this very little time that we have together to focus on the 4 principal treaties. The Outer Space Treaty, Liability Convention, Registration Convention, and the Rescue and Return Agreement. The Outer Space Treaty is the most important. I mean, it sets the tone for all international space activities. And the Liability Convention is absolutely critical because it talks about when you're at fault and what to do if you registration convention requires that you tell your government what you're putting in space so that we can find you when it doesn't behave properly. And the rescue and return agreement says if my astronaut goes into your country by accident, because there is an accident, please don't keep him or her as a prisoner, please return them home. That's layperson's overview of the International Space Treaties. So I have this fear that we're running out of time. Arnold, where are we really on time?
You have 1 minute, because we're supposed to start at 12:45.
Gotcha.
Thank you very much for appreciate it.
Okay, so the next 4 slides provide a more thoughtful summary of each of the treaties. And I will leave you with that because I don't know what the process is for obtaining the slides, but I'm delighted to share these with anyone in the room who would like them. And if I could just use that 1 minute that I have left to entertain some questions, I'd be delighted.